This week on Head to Head, The Rise of Skywalker, The Aftermath.
You're listening to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars. Begins now.
Hello, everybody. I'm Eric Vansel.
And I'm Daryl Sanders.
We're your hosts for this podcast. So we're pretty much in the post-Rise of Skywalker period.
Yeah.
How many times have you seen the movie?
Well, first of all, Happy New Year to you, man.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. This is the first podcast of the new year.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So Happy New Year to you. And yeah, man, I actually, over the break, I have not had a chance to see it except for the time that we had, just because I've been so inundated with so many other things for my job and everything like that. But hopefully this weekend I can kind of check it out with my grandfather, because I know he's really itching to see it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and kind of like you, being busy with, a bunch of other work-related stuff, I did manage to sneak out and see it that Sunday.
Oh, okay.
So, you and I, and I saw it on Thursday. I managed to see it on Sunday. And I have to say that, I loved it.
Okay.
I'm not necessarily saying that it increased my enjoyment of it.
Okay, because I was just about to ask that.
Yeah, because it's one of those things that I loved it just as much the second time as I did the first time. And I think that it's funny because I've been talking, of course, to a couple of people about it. And, we've had, comments on this channel about it. And there's a couple of things that I think that people have to remember when they're going into this movie. Because, one of the comments was basically saying that, we're looking at it, through the eyes of nostalgia and stuff like that. And then there's other people that are nitpicking every little thing. And the one thing that I keep trying to remind people, and this is not like trying to be a Star Wars apologist, because as you know, you and I are very critical of a lot of things in particularly the sequel trilogy.
Definitely.
But even in the prequels, and even a couple of things here and there in
the original trilogy.
The original trilogy, which is essentially the gold standard of filmmaking. So, look, it's not that we don't see the weaknesses of the movies. It's just that people keep treating this like it's a sci-fi movie. It's not. It's a fairy tale. When you're listening to a fairy tale and it's once upon a time, whatever, are you really saying like, well, like if you look at, Rapunzel let down her hair and, guy climbed up it. Are you really sitting there saying like, well, it's not really realistic. The hair could support the weight of it's a fairy tale.
Right.
You accept these things.
Right.
I'm not saying that means you should let everything go, but I think people are always looking at these movies like they're sci-fi movies, and they're not. They have sci-fi elements, but they're essentially fairy tales.
Yeah, but I think there has to be a sense of, and I think the things that people are talking about when it comes to those things are that, like, you have to like have a sense of realism though to some degree. Like, we get that it's a fairy tale, and it's it's not it's Star Wars, not Star Trek. So
right.
Yes, I understand. However, some things are kind of like it does take you like, okay, like this is especially when it's not been done before. Not saying that it can't be done, but it's just like, okay, the laws of physics and everything is just kind of like, okay, especially when they kind of give you a hint. Like, I'll give you a great example, like the whole Leia Mary Poppins thing. She blows out and then she starts to freeze. Like, you see it on her body, like she's starting to freeze. So it's like, okay, that's dealing with the coldness of space. So it's like, okay, why wouldn't the vacuum and the pressure and everything else of space be a factor? If that's a factor, everything else should be a factor. That's the only issue I had. That's one of the main issues I had with that.
Seemed to me like the main issue I had with that was just the Mary Poppins-esque way that they did it. I didn't really have a problem with that part because she was instantly, starting to freeze, but then the Force kind of kicked in and sealed her and, kind of revived her a little bit enough to. Plus, being that Leia's not really a Force user like Luke or like Rey are, it wouldn't be her first instinct. So I think the Force kind of, because that's one of the things that I think where the fairy tale aspect comes into is that sometimes people use the Force. Sometimes the Force does things on its own. I've noticed that that's been a common theme, and it's been not like one of those revisionist history where, you know, they do something and it's like, oh, we got to explain this, where Lucas says it's just a movie.
Well, I mean, even Qui-Gon kind of said it. I think, I'm trying to remember the exact quote, but and it was in the, obviously it was in Phantom Menace, but it was,
yeah.
but it was something to the effect of the Force is, it's something, but it also obeys your commands too.
Well, I mean, Obi-Wan said that in the original.
True, but I think Qui-Gon also kind of mentioned it first, but it was basically hinting to the fact that the Force sometimes does, like you said, does things on its own. So, and then there's also time where it does just listen to you, what you want it to do. So,
yeah. So, I mean, and that's one of those instances. But I think most of the stuff in the Rise of Skywalker, I mean, I get it. It's not that I don't understand the criticisms. And it's one of those things that if the criticisms cause you, like if there's enough of them where you didn't enjoy the movie, hey, I get it. But before you let it get to that point, I would just caution people that you might be, I guess, critical of it because you're looking at it wrong. You know what I mean? It's like they're looking at it like it's a sci-fi film, not a fantasy film.
Right.
It's basically a fairy tale.
Yeah, the intent, of what it is versus what your expectations are.
Because, you know, another criticism that you hear is like, okay, and I understand it, that from where they were, from around, you know, Exegol or whatever, Lando would have to go back, like try to rally up as many people as possible that all have like battle-ready ships, fly back, and because the whole Rise of Skywalker takes place basically within like 16 hours. But from where they were to get back to the core worlds would probably take like a week or two. You know, and that's just to go one way. So it'd almost be impossible for them to make that trip. That's true. And that's even true within what we know of the universe. So, I mean, it's not that it isn't a fair criticism, but again...
Well, we don't know that that's where they went, though, where he went back all the way there. That's not really...
Yeah, no, we actually do know that. That's been verified within... That's like in the whole, like, Encyclopedia Rise of Skywalker. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's been verified. Not to mention the people that he brought back with him were... I mean, it's...
Because I'm thinking, like, you know, you could have said, okay, if you know this is where we have to go, then you can just say, okay, well, you all jump here to this spot and meet me here, and then we can meet the rest of the way.
Yeah, they could, and there are other explanations, but, you know, again, I get it. But then again, the other aspect of it is, you know, people don't really look at Lord of the Rings like this.
No, but
you know what I mean?
See, it's kind of like the world initially was set up that way from day one to be that way. But I think, but see, my biggest thing, and to that point of the whole Lando going back to get everybody, it took 16 hours. Look, I wasn't even thinking about that. The big thing there I really thought about was this. In order to get to Exegol, it was basically like going through like the Kessel Run. Yeah.
Actually, so my thing exactly is like, what it reminded me of.
Kylo, you can see why he was able to do it. Rey, you can see why she's able to do it. You know, Lando, to a certain degree, he's a pretty good pilot. Okay.
Yeah, but how's like this entire fleet of ships?
That's what I'm talking about. Exactly.
Yeah, and that's a fair criticism.
That's my point. Now, unless the only way I could see that remotely happening is if maybe you had exact coordinates past all that, so you can just jump.
Yeah, and I mean that could have been the case.
That's the only way I could see you getting around that.
You know, and these are things that will occur to me while I'm watching the movie, but it doesn't necessarily take me out of it. Like,
right.
You just kind of accept it for what it is. That's not to mean that I'm going to accept every single thing that they put in front of me. But you know what? The Rise of Skywalker was a really good Star Wars movie, so hopefully you guys get a chance to go out and see it a couple of times. You know, of course, we're going to be talking about it a little bit later in the show. But,
well, actually, this leads right into our really good
Cantina, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's do it. Let's go to the Cantina.
All right. So Rise of Skywalker. Does it all make sense? That's the big thing.
Yeah.
So,
boy, were we really close on that one.
Yeah. So,
sorry for my voice, by the way, guys. I got this whole sinus infection going, and it's kind of messing me up.
But
'tis the season.
Yeah, we'll say, man. So a lot of people, like I said, have a lot of criticisms about, does it make sense? I think that and one of the big things is that I think they answered most of the big questions, but there are still some big questions that you and I have already talked about off camera that they didn't answer. Namely, the biggest one is like, how did Palpatine even survive?
Supposedly, there are deleted scenes that answer that question. But yeah, if we're taking the film as it is.
But see, that's not something you delete. Like, I mean, that's a pivotal, like, you can't not let that
Well, I'll tell you this. I could, only because, and I've had a lot of debates with people.
Okay.
Because there's a Facebook group called My Star Wars Life. Mm-hmm. I've been on there all the time lately. Mm-hmm. And especially because once you comment and people are commenting back, you get notifications, and it just furthers you doing it. And I mean, they're a pretty good group of people, and some people can get a little nasty on it but you know what? For the fact that we have a divisive, toxic Star Wars fan base right now, overall, everybody's pretty cool. You don't get a whole lot of people. I mean, there's disagreements, but it's not, venomous, right?
Right.
So I've been on this, and there have been people that have brought this up. But again, it was kind of explained. It's just that people want to see it. Palpatine basically said, look, the dark side, leads to paths that some consider to be unnatural. It's kind of like there's a little bit of, Sith magic going on that's allowed me to do this.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't need to see it. I just need him to explain it, because, like, that's what
everybody... But that is the thing. It's kind of like he's not going to basically tell... the explanation from everything that I've read from official sources and things like that, which are supported with that statement that he makes in the movie, is that the body that he actually was in, his actual body, did perish in Return of the Jedi. But he essentially possessed a corpse and, was able to kind of come back from that, because... We all know that, Darth Plagueis was experimenting, and, Palpatine was obsessed with continuing that work and creating life and doing all that stuff. It's kind of one of those things that you might want to know more, but honestly, for the story, you don't need to know. I'll tell you what actually fits more into that.
Okay.
That bugs me.
I pass the shoot.
See, I can live with that, right? Okay. Because they did at least address it. Would it have been nice to get something a little bit more specific than a rehash of the line from Revenge of the Sith? Yeah. But did they address it? Yes, they addressed it. Here's what I don't understand. So throughout the sequel trilogy, they're like, oh yeah, we thought Luke Skywalker was a myth. And... the Jedi, the Force, all that, it's all true, all of it, right? The whole, it's like this is a mystery to them. So you get to Rise of Skywalker. Yeah, right. All of a sudden it's like, oh, the Sith are back. Oh, well, how do you know how to speak Sith? And it's kind of like, dude, how do you guys know all this stuff about the Sith when the Jedi have been a mystery, even though they were once like practically like the police force of the galaxy?
Right.
The Sith... at that time, had been extinct for a millennium.
Yeah. You actually had more Jedi running around than Sith. So
yeah, you had like 2 Sith running around, and half the time they didn't even know that's who they were.
Right.
The Jedi didn't even believe the Sith were back as late as the Phantom Menace. Mm-hmm. You only had a handful of people that even knew that Palpatine and Vader were actual Sith. They knew they were Force users. They knew that Anakin was a Jedi. They didn't even know that Vader was Anakin.
Right.
Now, all of a sudden, it's kind of like, and even in the sequel trilogy, like I could accept it if everybody kind of like read, there was extensive history taught about the Jedi and the Sith and the wars and all that. But there obviously wasn't, because here's Luke Skywalker, who actually saved the galaxy and everybody knew. 30 years later, everybody thinks he's a myth. And that, the Jedi, the Force, that all this stuff was like a fairy tale or something. But then a few years later, everybody suddenly knows who a Sith is. Now, somebody could maybe say, oh, yeah, well, it's because, part of Palpatine's broadcast was he gave this whole dissertation on what a Sith was. But it's like you got Zori Bliss going, well, how do you know how to speak Sith? Yeah. It's like, how do you guys know who the Sith are?
Well, I think in her case alone, I would say it's probably because she's a part of that dark world. I mean, like running Spice, it's basically a drug dealer. So in that regard, like, okay, when you're kind of in that underworld, you kind of know like other things that, the common, it's kind of like, being, a person who's a drug dealer or whatever, you kind of know, oh, I know arms dealers. I know people over here. I know folks over here who do other dirty stuff. So it's kind of like you're in the same playground, so to speak. So for her, I can see.
Maybe the only support that I can offer for that, because that would almost be like if there was suddenly a group of criminals that had supernatural powers. Mm-hmm. Now, the police force that had supernatural powers, all of a sudden everybody forgets about, but everybody knows, it's kind of like the Sith were even more underground than the Jedi.
But see, I think the big thing was the Empire. Because after the fall of the Empire, all that came out. Because you got to remember, like, when people found out about Leia being the daughter of Vader, all that stuff started hitting political airwaves.
Well, yes, but they didn't necessarily realize, like, they knew that Vader was a Force user, but I don't know how much they knew.
But Leia probably had to speak to that, and that's when that probably came out.
Well, I read Bloodline. She never said he was a Sith.
Well, I mean, it might not have been covered in that Pacific.
And plus, it seemed like everybody, period, I mean, if you actually, when you go see it again, because that's what actually jumped out at me the second time I saw it, was how super familiar everybody was with the Sith all of a sudden. Mm-hmm. They weren't even mentioned that much in the original trilogy, and you had two people in there.
True.
So I mean, it's kind of like if they were all, if the Jedi weren't considered like basically a mythological figure or, group, I can maybe hang with it a little bit more, but it's sort of like everybody forgot them.
I do have an answer.
Uh-oh.
Well,
I think Ray's been talking about it because she's been reading the Jedi text. No. And it's like, hey, everybody, check these guys out.
No, it's actually in the Rise of Skywalker, actually, though. I mean...
I hope so.
They're a race, too.
Well, yeah.
So when you see Palpatine and you see like all these Sith, I mean, they're not all Force users. They're just a race of people.
But that race was like vanquished like centuries ago. Those people that you see in Palpatine's little lair or whatever are really more like Sith acolytes that are disciples.
Almost kind of like that dude from Vader's little capsule.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of like that. And, there were some that were alluded to in the Aftermath trilogy. It wouldn't even surprise me if Chris Terrio put them in there because of that. Because they were a group of people that kind of had this worship thing going of Vader and the Sith and all that. And they're trying to, find different artifacts and kind of like magically rebirth Vader somehow or something like that. Well, so that could be. So, I mean... we'll see. There were things that didn't make sense, but overall, again, if you take the movie at face value, I think that it was overall a satisfying conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, there's still things that have.
But you're right. There were definitely some things
questions that still have gone unanswered. So I think that, I mean, guess we found out, who Ray's parents were, somewhat, and then we found out.
Yeah, right, kind of.
And then we found out who she's related to. That's major, definitely. But I mean, one of the biggest questions has been like, where's Lando been all this time? But I don't think that's really a big major thing. That's just
but he actually went off, and after the thing, he went back to They actually sort of alluded to some of this. There's a lot in that encyclopedia, by the way. I don't have it yet, but I've read about it. And then, of course, he was also talking about how he would go off on adventures. And that was actually in the movie where he was talking about he'd help Luke, try to find all this stuff. So
that part, yeah.
It kind of shows that.
Yeah, but I guess during the whole resistance time when they're trying to fight, like, okay, where the heck were you? Which I get, but. Yeah, I mean, overall, did it make sense? For the most part, yeah. I mean, I think that some of the things Kylo's turn, I could see why that. At first, it didn't make sense to me, but now it does. Mm-hmm. Because at first I really didn't truly believe it, but
yeah, you can. It's kind of like you could see it and it makes sense, but I think I see what you're probably thinking, where it's like, okay, you spend all this time showing how he's evil and everything. Kylo's turn his turn isn't as confusing to me as Rey's love for him.
Yeah,
that's really the part that doesn't make sense, because all you've seen is this guy killing everybody.
Well, I think it's just simply because she saw
when
she's been connected to him,
I guess. And it is true that he has been tempted by the light. Yeah.
And then the fact that that's why she told Luke, she's like, I feel the good in him. No different than when Luke said the same thing about Vader,
Yeah, because Luke was probably like, oh, yeah.
With this again.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
Exactly.
Luke Skywalker once thought as you do.
But, yeah, so I think, at some point, because when you look at, The Last Jedi, she's always repulsed by him. It's like, can you put a towel on or something?
Yeah, I mean,
so she's just
a lot of that stuff. I think the problem is, and here's the thing, I don't necessarily think that in and of itself, I think the movie did what it had to do, what it could do to tie everything up. Because let's face it, the movie should have actually had the whole saga. Well, not the whole saga, but the whole trilogy should have had a meeting where whoever was set to direct it, they sit everybody down in a room and they actually go over an outline and they figure out a story, a cohesive story. Mm-hmm. Because no matter what you think about the prequels, they have a cohesive story.
True.
And that's where...
The only thing that was wrong with the prequels is the execution.
The execution, exactly. But the story, and that's why the prequels aren't quite as maligned in some ways as the sequel trilogy, because the general consensus is that people like the sequel trilogy better, but they're just having a hard time following the story. And that's because it was a choose your own adventure kind of thing. It's like each director got to take it wherever they wanted to go. Well, by the time you get to the third movie, you kind of have a mess because there's a lot of things you have to tie up. So yeah. I think the Rise of Skywalker makes sense as much as it can make sense.
Okay. That's a fair one.
All right. So what do we got next?
All right. Next, the Clone Wars. We finally get an official date.
Yes.
So the Clone Wars are returning in 2020. Is set to premiere.
That's this year for all you guys still stuck in 2019.
Yeah, it's set to premiere February 17th. So, after if you still got some Valentine's Day candy laying around, you can open the box and watch the Clone Wars.
Now, here's the thing. Have you heard anything about whether they're going to do are they going to release one episode per week? Or are they
That's the big question. So we don't know that. We know it's 12 episodes. So there's 12 episodes of the Clone Wars that are going to be released. We don't know how many seasons, if this is going to be the final season or if they're actually going to have more. They're probably going to base it depending on Disney. It's okay, if it's getting a big...
Yeah, I don't know. I think this is going to be it for the Clone Wars.
I mean, if it is, it's fine. It's fine.
And
because I know
the only reason why I say that, of course, money can change that. But the only reason why I say that is because basically Dave Filoni wanted to do a season 7 because he was never able to tie up the story the way he wanted to tie it up.
Right.
Because it was just canceled right in the middle of his thing. There was a bunch of, unfinished episodes and a couple ones that were finished, so they cobbled together a season 6 based on what they had. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't really a proper conclusion to the series, and Filoni wanted a chance to go in and actually do that.
Yeah. I mean, like I say, if it is a one and done, I'm fine with that so long as we get a satisfying story.
There's actually talk about a sequel to Rebels, right?
No, I haven't heard that one.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's been making its rounds. Nothing's been confirmed. Because, there's a lot of things floating around. There's a possible Darth Maul, series.
Yeah, no, that
there's a Vader series.
Yep.
There's like all these things that they keep coming up. So, there's got to be something to all this, but, who knows? But yeah, this whole sequel series to Rebels now is kind of like the latest.
Oh, wow.
Of the rumors.
Yeah, well, the Clone Wars, like I said, it's scheduled. We don't know if it's actually going to, because how with the Mandalorian, it started off on one day and then they, it was.
Well, no, it was every Friday. It was just
the initial premiere, though,
was like 2 days.
Two days. So we don't know if that's going to happen with the Clone Wars or not. That's just the thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of hoping they do what they've always done. Well, actually, no, they did do a week to week when it was on the Cartoon Network.
It was on the Cartoon. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, it was week to week.
But I mean, we don't know.
I would guess that's how they're going to handle it, since that was how it was handled on the Cartoon Network, and they see that worked very well for the Mandalorian.
I was about to say, yeah, that exactly. It
makes
perfect.
me think, and actually, they did that with Rebels too. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what I'm thinking, because all of them have been week to week.
Yeah, I mean, but sometimes people kind of, especially with if it's a one and done thing, they might just drop it all at once. So I can understand that with Rebels. I mean, with Mandalorian, you knew that it was actually going to be more to that.
Where do you think they're going to go with it?
For Clone Wars?
Yeah.
Man.
That's what we're.
Yeah.
In case you missed it.
Well, we were talking about a bunch of different things.
That's true. We were talking about a bunch of stuff, but still.
Yeah, Clone Wars. I don't know. I mean, I know they're really going to cover, Ahsoka's whole banishment, basically, from the temple.
Well, and I mean, there are some, and that's the thing that I have to really give it to them. It's almost like how the Rise of Skywalker trailers were, where you get a bunch of scenes, but you don't really know the context and where they're going with all this stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're going to deal with Ahsoka.
And I think there's going to see things I think you're really going to start to see something happen with Anakin, where you really start to see his distrust. Well, he's already starting to distrust already, but I think we're going to start seeing those seeds start to come to fruition a little bit with Anakin too.
I wonder, though. I only wonder that because if you look at the very beginning of Revenge of the Sith, I don't know, it's kind of hard to read, because you could make the argument for or against the fact that he was already well on that path. Mm-hmm. It almost seemed like it was kind of the ocean. You know how the ocean is kind of like, 5 feet, 10 feet, 100 feet kind of thing? It seemed like that's how Anakin's path, I suppose, to distrusting the Jedi and moving to the dark side has been, where there's little things that make him question things, but at the same time, nothing's really derailed him. And even at the beginning of Revenge of the Sith, it's really the events of Revenge of the Sith that really accelerate his distrust and eventual hatred, actually.
Well, I think what it is it really, if you really look at his fall, it's like, okay, there's little things that he doesn't like, but he goes along with it because it's like, well, it's protocol and whatever the case may be.
Right.
And because Obi-Wan is like right there by his side, and he trusts no one more than Obi-Wan. And Obi-Wan is pretty much almost like the gold standard Jedi to him in a way.
Yeah, it's kind of like if Obi-Wan's dealing with it, then who is he to?
Yeah, and then on top of that, you look at it from the standpoint of Obi-Wan probably keeps him grounded with a lot, but it's not until like he starts having to go out on his own more, and he's experiencing things, and when they start having him do little stuff, especially against his friend in particular, Palpatine, now he's kind of like, okay, well, why are you guys having me spy? And why are you having me doing this? Like, when have we ever started doing this? And so
it was almost like he sees a Jedi as the ones that are actually turning, not him. And he's like trying to maintain what they were. And that actually, to me, was one of the cooler points about it, that you could really see where, once again, it's from a certain point of view.
Well, yeah. And also it's just kind of like you, in times of, you know, a war or great times, it's like sometimes you do have to do things that are, and that kind of just brings back to the whole Rogue One situation where you start seeing like, okay, these guys, they're the good guys, but they had to get their hands dirty. And sometimes that's, even the Jedi aren't exempt from that.
Nope.
You know, so that's,
well, and that was the problem. And that's why I think that Yoda was really not happy about the fact that the Jedi were being pulled into this war. Mm-hmm. You know, and even in the beginning of Attack of the Clones, I think, when, you know, Mace is like, well, we're keepers of the peace, not soldiers. Not soldiers. And it's like they felt like, listen, you guys are, you know, you're kind of bringing us more front and center into this whole war, and that's not what we're about. Right. You know, and then, of course, by Revenge of the Sith, they're all generals. Mm-hmm. You know, so it is a really interesting dynamic, not just between Anakin and Obi-Wan, but also between the Jedi and the rest of
the Republic.
How the war is going. You know, it's just a really, really interesting thing to see. Yep. So, I mean, who knows? Are you guys looking forward to the Clone Wars? Or, you know, is this something that you guys were satisfied with Season 6? And maybe you think they should have moved on to something else? Or, you know, what are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments below. All right, what do we got next?
All right, so next we have, what do you think the impact is of Star Wars on this generation? So that's why I have Mr. Little Broom Kid here, because he was deemed as the future almost. And, you know,
it's kind of weird that, I mean, I get it, but
that we didn't see him in Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah, I mean, because I understand his function was just to show that, look, everybody, the Force is available to everybody. Everybody's using it. It's not just a Jedi Sith thing or whatever. But at the same time, it just kind of seemed like they set up that story a little bit. Mm-hmm. And you're right. That is a really good analogy of the future generation's reaction to Star Wars, because you're finding that younger folks are like, they're into it, but it's not
how it was for us.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what, and do you think that's the sequel's fault? Do you think that's the prequel's fault? Do you think it's...
No. Because the prequel generation's firmly into it. Okay. And in fact, the prequels are actually coming back as being more and more appreciated, you know, by everybody. And I think what it is that, you know, Star Wars created this whole phenomenon that a lot of people have latched onto, and a lot of people are doing it correctly. You know, like you look at the Marvel universe. Mm-hmm. The whole Marvel, the MCU is kind of like the template now for how to do a franchise correctly. All right. And yeah, I think that Lucasfilm is dropping the ball as far as how to handle the movie side of it. Because The Mandalorian, I mean, up until The Witcher just recently unseated him, The Mandalorian was the most watched streaming show of all time. Mm-hmm. And everybody's into The Mandalorian. Mm-hmm. Young, old, whatever. So I don't necessarily think it's Star Wars. I think it's how they're handling the film thing right now. Even a lot of people really were enjoying Rogue One, but it's a sequel trilogy. Everybody's kind of critical of that.
And do you think that people aren't interested because they didn't have a clear picture? Like it faltered too much?
Yeah, because I think that even though everybody's aware of Star Wars and it's ingrained in our, you know, our whole thing, it's not exactly the way that it was, you know, like you said, for us. Mm-hmm. And, you know, kids have a lot of different choices now. They're not drawn to the nostalgia of it. Right. And the problem is that whereas George Lucas had a vision and basically took Star Wars into where he felt it should go, believe it or not, I think that that's the difference. I think that Disney is trying to almost create a Star Wars nostalgia thing and try to create fan service, and they're failing by doing that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not going anywhere new, really. You know, and that's the problem. I think that that's why there's even though, you know, because there's people where it's kind of like, you know, you'll see parents. I've seen this on Facebook a lot. They're like, yeah, you know, I went to see Star Wars. Oh, my kids didn't want to go.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
It's the first time in history I've ever seen that. And I hate to say it, but I think it started with The Last Jedi. Because everybody was all about The Force Awakens. It's still the #1 domestic film of all time. Yes, Avengers Endgame, I believe, is like the highest grossing box office film worldwide. But domestically, still The Force Awakens.
Mm.
Avengers didn't overtake The Force Awakens domestically.
So, do you think that, I guess when you look at The Last Jedi, you know, should that have given, I guess, more fan service, or a little bit more fan service, I should say, that would have kept everybody engaged?
You know, I don't know, because, you know, it's a mixed bag, and you have to be very careful with Star Wars. I look at Star Wars a lot, like I look a lot of bands from a particular era.
Mm-hmm.
The 80s, what they call hair metal bands, are
Right.
a great example of this. So the 90s come along, and grunge is big, and they stick out like a sore thumb, because the music scene is nothing like what they're used to, familiar with. Everything's changed. So it's like, okay, what do? Do you try to play grunge music now?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you stick with what you do? And it's kind of like, ooh. Well, that was the thing. The bands that actually stuck with what they did and didn't change fared through. They didn't sell as many albums. But then when stuff started coming around and people started getting an appreciation for it, they were never looked at as sellouts. Whereas the ones that tried to go a different style and fit in with, try to adopt a sound that was popular at the time, it wasn't enough to get a new fan base, to get the fans of that sound, because everybody looked at them as, you know, some hairspray and spandex band, no matter what they did. And then the bands the fans that were originally into them looked at them like, well, I don't know what this is. It doesn't sound anything what your last album was or anything that I like. So it abandoned them. And that's kind of what Star Wars is doing. It's like, if you try to be nostalgia and reflect the past, and let's just say sound like your last album, people are going to say, no, this is derivative. What are you doing? Go somewhere different. If you try to now go grunge, like The Last Jedi, now you're going to alienate everybody. Because no matter how gritty something is, no matter how dark something is, it's Star Wars. You know, people that aren't a fan of Star Wars are still going to look at it like, oh, it's Star Wars. Whereas the Star Wars fans are going to look at it, and, you know, like you and I acknowledge, like, okay, it was good. I liked it. Mm-hmm. I thought it was a really good movie. I thought he made some really good choices. Like, a lot of it centered, I think, around Luke, how he handled Luke.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there were other criticisms that people shared. A lot of people don't like the whole Canto Bight thing.
Right.
But, I mean, at the same time, though, it's like, you know, everybody wanted Luke to come in and save the day and, you know, destroy, like, hundreds of troopers and bring down Star Destroyers and everything. But having a disillusioned Luke Skywalker actually made more sense for the story. It really did. If you really stop and think about it, it really did.
I think, but see, and this is where I feel like, you know, balancing the Force, if you will. So I think that you need to give folks a balance. I think you need to give them something they're familiar with, but you still give them the push to something new. It's no different than when you get a new a cell phone. Like, when they released the, iPhone, iOS, or the iPhone 11 or something like that. Like, okay, it still has the familiar things that you normally use on a day-to-day basis, but we have a couple new twists and a little
something
extra for you to keep you interested and keep you wanting to buy the iPhone. And I think that's the thing and I think that's kind of like when you look at Star Wars, you have to do it that way. I think they were good with going with Luke being disillusional, but I think they went too long with it.
Not only that, but they probably shouldn't have killed him off.
That too. And I think if they would have actually had Luke come in even if not the end, but midway, he starts to change. So let's just say, okay, at the beginning, he tosses the light, he looks at the lightsaber, tosses it or whatever, and walks off, and everybody's just like, whoa, what the heck? And you see, if you focus on his
I do
pain,
remember the reaction in the theater when he did that. We're like, really? That's what you're going with after this? Yeah, that was jarring, actually.
Yeah. But I think that's good, though, because it's like, okay, what the heck is about to happen now? And that puts you on the edge of your seat.
Sure, it's the last thing you expected him to do.
Exactly. But then let's just say by the time, by the time she goes to, when Rey goes to go get Kylo, I think by that time he probably should have okay, at least okay, if you're going to go against him, let me give you some things. And then really, we see him really training her, really showing
Rocky montage.
Basically, almost, and let's just really see Luke, being Luke again. And it's just like, okay.
Yeah, see, that would have been, and that's really what it comes down to. But again, I honestly think that people could have dealt with a lot of elements if you take the raw story the way it was. The problem, once again, is you could tell by The Last Jedi, there's no direction here. Mm-hmm. That they're just kind of letting everybody do what they want with these movies. Mm-hmm. There's no central theme. They're just being somewhat derivative. And it's like, the thing is that George Lucas, being the one that actually created the stuff, as much crap as he got for the prequels, once it's like you said, it was the execution.
All right.
What they probably should have done, in hindsight, is probably taken George Lucas's versions of 7, 8, and 9 and just done them. And pretty much that would have been like The Empire Strikes Back. I'm not saying it would have been as good as The Empire Strikes Back. I'm just saying that was the model. Yeah. George does a story. He kind of oversees a lot of things. Somebody else actually directs and makes a movie.
Well, the biggest thing, too, though, and like I said, the sequel is really, really difficult because it's really the only thing you can really compare it to the originals, because the originals were the originals. Like, okay, of course, there was nothing like it that we've ever seen before. 1977, Star Wars hits the scene, A New Hope, boom, everybody's like, whoa, what the heck is this? And then, of course, it's subsequently followed by Empire Strikes Back and then Return of the Jedi. Wow, what a great saga, because we've never seen anything like that. Awesome. 1999 rolls around. All right, now we got Phantom Menace. But the story is already laid out for us. We already know what the story is. We've said this before. We already know what it is. We just have to figure out how we're going to get there.
And so a lot of the minor details, too.
That's what I'm saying, the minor details
you're
of
right.
it.
We know the macro level of it, but...
Exactly. So we just need to figure out how we're going to get to the end. So it's no mystery, really, of what this is. Yeah. No different like when the original trilogy came out, there was the mystery. What the heck is a Star Wars? I wasn't around in 77, but you were, and I'm sure everybody has echoed your thoughts. Like, no one knew what this was until they saw it, and everybody was like, whoa, this is utterly amazing. So now we have the prequels. Everybody kind of knows what Star Wars was. Okay, now we're going to show you how Darth Vader became Darth Vader.
Well, and what you're bringing up is kind of what I liken to. But again, it could be done well, because look at Titanic. Mm-hmm. It's not like people didn't know the story.
Exactly.
It's exactly like that. But that was pulled off flawlessly, and that's a little bit of kind of what you're talking about. Like people know it, but
see, with the sequel, it's kind of like, and we even said this, like, when we first heard that there was going to be a sequel. Well, what the heck are they going to do? What's the story now? Because the big Emperor and Vader are gone. So now what? Like,
it would have been. it's too bad that they didn't actually do this whole deal like about 10 or 15 years earlier.
I agree.
Because then they could have essentially adapted Timothy Zahn's novels.
True.
You know, and basically Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, Mark Hamill, they all would have been a lot younger. They would have been, you could have actually done those stories.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I'm going to say that the future of Star Wars, as far as the impact that it has on generations, it's still a monolithic franchise. I mean, it's unstoppable.
True.
But as far as how far in the future it actually carries, it's going to depend a lot on now what they do from this point on.
Yeah.
I think that The Mandalorian's a really good start because a lot of people are into it. And they just have to get the right people to make Star Wars films because you can't just get anybody to do it.
Well, the thing is, too, I think now with everything, the way that, you know, we watch content, we consume content mainly off of Netflix original series and things of that nature. I think what's going to be able to happen with Star Wars is that now that you can finally break away from the saga trilogy, now you can explore those different areas. So like, you can do a Game of Thrones style Star Wars thing where people can, it's Game of Thrones meet Star Wars. Cool. But what if we had a Witcher Star Wars, or what if we had something like, so it's something that's familiar.
If they do a Old Republic, then
that's
you
what
go.
I'm saying.
And that's probably what they're going to do.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is like the things that are interesting, this newer generation of what they want to see.
I'll tell you what,
you can actually just kind of infuse that with Star Wars.
Yeah.
And then, boom, you kind of always will have that impact.
Well, and I still say you could do, this is a little bit of a side note, but I mean, it's talking about this, is you could still do a genre type of thing. Like you can have a romantic comedy set in the Star Wars universe. You can have a horror movie set in the Star Wars universe. A political thriller set in, you know, you could take the common genres of movies that we have today, set them in the Star Wars universe, and you're good. But here's an interesting that's come up on that Facebook group that I was talking about. Somebody finally basically said it. Hey, man, what about the Yuuzhan Vong series?
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah. And everybody's like, yeah, but I mean, you know, because of the fact that you heavily needed Han, Luke, Leia, and all them. So I proposed, like, hey, just use Rey, Finn, and Poe in their place. Because if you read the Yuuzhan Vong series of books, which is incredibly long, they need to condense it. I mean, yeah. It was bloated. It went on.
Some books went on too long. It dragged it too long.
Some books weren't even necessary.
Yeah, that's
the main
what I'm saying.
story. It was like, it was a series of like 23 books. And the sad thing was the story was incredible. Like if you take it over the whole 23 books, you can go, okay, this is necessary. That's not. This is, you take all the plots and stuff that are necessary and cohesive. You put that in either a series or maybe make it a trilogy of movies, it would be amazing. Put Rey, Finn, Poe, Chewbacca, Lando. You could still have all the guys. You just replace the original trilogy guys with the new cast, and the story still relatively holds up. So, I mean, only time will tell. But what about you guys? Do you think that, you know, Star Wars is got a shelf life now? Or do you think that, you know, it can go on forever? They just have to make a few course corrections. Let us know in the comments below. All right, what's next?
Well, next we have Duel of the Fates. So this week, which had the better conclusion? The Rise of Skywalker or the Avengers Endgame?
You know what's interesting about this question? Is the fact that both Endgame and Rise of Skywalker have gotten heavy criticisms. Because the problem, well, speaking specifically with Avengers, they teed it up so well in Infinity Wars. Yeah. That a lot of people were disappointed with what was essentially part 2. Right. Which was Endgame. So, and the other problem with it too is that technically the Avengers is wrapped up over a 2-movie period. But then you can also say that it was also tying up like 20 some odd movies instead of 9. I'm always put on the spot on this show.
It's a hard one.
It is. It really is difficult because there's a lot of similarities between the two.
Absolutely.
It's a Star Wars show. I'm going to go for Rise of Skywalker.
Well, I mean, you know, I feel your pain. I think with Rise of Skywalker, I think it tied everything together in the sense of, you know, from the beginning, what Palpatine has been trying to do for the longest. He's always been trying to create life. You know, there was the theory that he created Vader, you know, then there was, of course, the clones. So that was kind of him dabbling in that. And then, of course, he's still trying to perfect that path. And even Vader shared that same dream because he wanted to keep the ones he loved from dying. So, you know, that's kind of really the whole, premise of it all. And I think that overall, like, to conclude it, I'm going to probably say Avengers had the better conclusion, just simply because of the heartstrings that it pulled, the things that they did with it. It really took you on that ride. Whereas I feel like Rise of Skywalker was a rush. I feel like if Rise of Skywalker, this is one of the things, and I said this in the beginning, I remember I can actually say this now, that yes, Rise of Skywalker should have been 2 movies. It definitely should have been 2 movies, because if you would have covered a big portion of Palpatine and his whole, and created that angst, and they're like, okay, Palpatine's back, now what? And then now you can, in the second half, you can hit us with all these crazy space battles and everything like that. You know, you could address why no one came when Leia called. You could address, there's so many meaty things that could have happened in Rise of Skywalker that would have given depth to character. It would show the character development. It would have given our characters something to fight for, instead of everything just, oh, okay, we need that, cool, we found that. Yeah, right. You know what I'm saying? Like, it would have created.
Well, definitely. It would have created.
Yeah, it would have slowed down that pacing.
Didn't bother me. I actually enjoyed it, but I will say this: if we're gonna go for your version of it, I think it doesn't necessarily have to be 2 movies. It could have just been a longer movie, like make it 3 hours.
3 hours?
3 hours and 20 minutes, like Titanic or something. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, make it longer if you want to do it. But I didn't necessarily have I thought that the Rise of Skywalker slowed down where it needed to slow down. And the pace, I think, actually helped the movie. The problem is that it probably needed to spend a little bit more time on developing some of the themes and things like that. Like, for what it was, I thought it was great. And even though I always say that it was a satisfying conclusion, I think it could have benefited maybe from an extra 15 or 20 minutes to give us a few more supporting scenes for certain things. But at the same time, while I actually agree with what you're saying about Endgame, I'm only saying Rise of Skywalker simply because I think that a lot of things, it more directly answered a lot of things that were happening in the films. I mean, Avengers Endgame couldn't possibly do that because it's over, you know, a crazy amount of movies. And that's the reason why I think the Marvel universe, the cinematic universe anyway, actually benefits, because you have all these standalone films, because what they do is they do the whole phase thing. So they have a bunch of standalone films, and then you have an Avengers movie
to anchor it,
that ties that story, i.e. that phase, and then they move on to the next one. You can't really do that with the Star Wars universe.
No, you can't. But I think that you can do. But I think because they knew that, they planned that, and that's their advantage. Is because whether they decided to do, we're just going to do a bunch of movies or we're going to actually have it go in phases. I think that all started in the
well, it's like you said, the planning. Yes, the planning is,
and that's
is
what
everything.
that's what gives to me Avengers the edge, is because it was planned that way.
Well, what I would do is I would say that the Rise of Skywalker, I'll still vote that it ties up the saga better. It's saga better. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I will always say is that the MCU does a way better job of its presentation and basically its whole planning. Mm-hmm. You know, because if you think about it, it's a lot harder to, come up with like a common tie up to, 20-some movies.
Or just how you bring in different characters. I mean, because it's like, all right, you kind of have the Avengers, like Civil War, for example, but then you were able to bring Spider-Man into that, and it's like, well, how?
Yeah, well, actually,
then,
it's funny about Civil War because a lot of people call that Avengers 1.5.
Exactly, because that's basically kind of what it was.
It kind of was, yeah, and that's the thing is that what I wish they would do with Star Wars, honestly, is bring in a lot of elements of the books, the comics, tie the canon together.
That would good, yeah.
And make it a little bit more cohesive. You'll get little Easter eggs once in a while, but
right.
A cohesiveness.
Yeah.
But
what do you guys think?
Yeah, what do you guys think? I'm going Rise of Skywalker, which instantly will turn off like half of you anyway. He's going Endgame, which is going to make him your new favorite host of the show. But hey, for kicks, just leave your comments in the comments section, and we can argue about it there.
Yep.
All right. What do we got next?
Next we have From a Certain Point of View.
I can hear it now.
We just left that.
Yeah,
but yeah, Certain Point of View. This is our feature topic, and we've kind of been already hinting on it already, but
yeah, we have.
This is basically the fans' response to the Rise of Skywalker. It's
the aftermath.
The aftermath.
And that was not a pun, by the way, of the whole book series.
But yeah, it's just like the aftermath, like how you all are feeling after the movie. For those of you who've seen it, there's still some divisiveness, between, hey, was it good? Was it bad?
I
liked
let's
it.
talk about that.
Go ahead.
Because this is like, I've watched so many reviews of the Rise of Skywalker on YouTube.
Yep.
I mean, a lot more than I ever did with any of the other movies. And it's fascinating because there is a lot of divisiveness, but it doesn't seem as toxic as The Last Jedi. And I think that's because there are more people that love the movie. It's kind of like you're getting a really weird...
It's a spectrum.
Yeah.
It's really a spectrum on this one.
Yes.
Yeah. Definitely. But I think that's because, it's a spectrum kind of movie, though. If you really look and because you have the things in there where there's a lot of nods and a lot of nostalgia in there. So some people love that. And then other people just like, okay, yes, we've seen this,
Well, that's a good point, too, because you even have different criticisms. Like you have maybe 10 people that really didn't like the movie or hated it. And some will actually point to very similar recurring themes. Mm-hmm. But then there's other people that have 10 different reasons. For some people, it was too much fan service. Mm-hmm. For others, it could be maybe there were plot points that didn't make sense to them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's just all kinds of different reasons.
Yeah, I think that's just, I think a lot of the reasons why, and this is why, like I said, I aforementioned that it needed to be two movies, is because the questions for the people who have issues with the plot points or things like that, I think with two movies, you could have really covered that and expanded it, such as, okay, well, I created Snoke and that's it. So it was just kind of like, okay, like, and
look, I'm even showing you a bunch of Snokes in an aquarium.
Yeah, exactly.
Basically.
You know,
it's
like I was watching like
cool.
Independence Day or something like that.
Well, but here's the thing, though, and this is what I find really funny about this whole thing is the fact that it's kind of like a friendlier Venom or something. I mean, people are either. It's like you're getting a lot more people defending the movie. And what I really found interesting was the box office because it opened a little bit less than... It actually opened higher than what Disney thought it would. So opening weekend, it made like $176 million or something. Mm-hmm. Disney thought it was only going to make 165. But it fell short of like the 210 or 15 or whatever that Last Jedi did. And it fell way short of the $245 million that
Force
Awakens did. So on one hand, you look at the opening weekend box office, you go, oh, well, it's the lowest. Even though it went beyond what Disney expected, it still was the lowest grossing of the three sequel trilogy films. But here's where it gets interesting, is that whereas The Last Jedi and everything started losing box office percentages, Rise of Skywalker gained. So over the last, week or so, it's actually made more money after it's like,
first weekend.
After it's like first weekend and all that than Last Jedi did. So it's seeming like there's some momentum there that either it's getting more repeat viewing or people are starting to read, maybe some reviews and say, I want to see it for myself.
Well, see, yeah, I think the thing is with those is that, so, of course, you have to, I look at it from this perspective. All right, so we all went to go see Last Jedi, and it was pretty much almost like universal that most people hated it. I mean, there's very few people who liked it. But I mean, I think most people there was a lot. That was like the first time it was really.
I don't know about that.
I would say I'll put it this way: it was the moment where people were just like, I don't know about this. But I have a bad feeling about this, if you will.
Yeah, I think that the negativity far outweighed, and it was another thing that if you liked it, this is another difference between The Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker. If you liked The Last Jedi, I mean, even if you said online that you remotely liked it, you were just crucified.
That's what I'm saying.
Whereas The Rise of Skywalker, there's a lot of people that are like, oh, this is stupid and you're kind of dumb but they're not. It's kind of like, well, if you like it, I get it.
Yeah, they get why you would like it. But I think the thing is because
they think you're an idiot, but they get it.
But The Last Jedi, you have that, and that's where, the seeds, almost kind of like Anakin, like those were your seeds of like distrust in the Star Wars franchise really began. Mm-hmm. Well, it actually kind of began a little bit in The Force Awakens for some, and then it was multiplied heavily by Last Jedi. So then by this time, it's like, okay, for those people who felt like, all right, 7 was kind of a rehash of A New Hope. All right, so then let's hope for the best for Last Jedi, and then Last Jedi lets you down. So then now you're really like, do I really want to go see Rise of Skywalker?
Right, and that's why I think that the box office numbers were a little bit lower. Exactly,
because even ourselves, when we first did our non-spoiler review, we talked about like, okay, when we first saw the initial reviews for those critics who were able to go see it, especially like Campia, we were like, uh-oh. Like, he hated it.
People, when these people are like, I didn't like this at all, it's like, ooh.
And we already kind of felt like, oh, this is going to be awesome because it's JJ and the Emperor's back. And we're really riding this wave, and we're just really hoping. We're like,
if you remember, the same thing was with The Last Jedi. Everybody was like, ooh, Rian Johnson's doing it. It's going to be amazing,
Well, yeah, we knew. But then we also knew it was the Luke movie. So that's why we were really excited, because at the end of Force Awakens, we finally see Luke. And then we knew, like, okay, Last Jedi, yeah, it's on. So once again, it's kind of
expectations.
The expectations were really high, and so I think that's the reason why a lot of the box office rates were low for the Rise of Skywalker, because you still had people on the fence. And then when you start hearing those initial reports come out, that's really going to shy people away from going out to see this until, excuse me, you start seeing other people like, no. So even on our favorite show, so we watch Jedi Council. So even listening to them, it's like, oh, okay, half of them like Mark Riley and, what's his name? Roka, like the movie. And then there's like the other was like, and Dennis, he was like, okay, yeah, it was cool. But then, the other young lady, she was like, I really didn't like it. So it's just kind of like, okay. So now even on certain shows, it's split. So
yeah, let me take a minute here. Rest in peace, Jedi Council. It was fun.
Yeah.
It's kind of should address, the whole Collider thing. Even though I don't necessarily, as a fan of a lot of Collider shows, I kind of wish they had changed their mind about going in a different direction. But hey, we're here. Yeah. So, come on, bring it in. And there's still a lot of great, all the people from Collider are doing their own shows now. So it's really cool. But yeah, you're right. A lot of those guys had split opinions too. And that was what I found interesting is even when you had a group of people doing a show, you basically had very divided opinions that weren't just like they liked or disliked different aspects of it. You actually had issues where, like, you had some people that intensely loved it, and then some people that really kind of were. I don't want to say hated it, because that's another difference. People don't hate the movie; they hate a lot of elements of the movie. But they're always quick to say, "Oh, I hated the movie," but there were some cool parts of it. Right. Last Jedi, they just hated it.
Yeah. Because it didn't give them enough of what, and that's what I was talking about before. Like, you got to have that balance.
Yeah.
I think, honestly, moving forward, quite honestly, I really do, in my heart of hearts, whoever is over like the writing and the story of any future Star Wars TV show, movie, needs to go through Filoni, because I think he's the only one who's really, he was the protege pretty much of Lucas. He truly gets it. We've seen it on numerous occasions, day in and day out, from the Clone Wars to even though he's only directed a couple episodes with The Mandalorian, but everything goes through them.
Yeah, I mean, it should be noted that it really is Favreau's show and his brainchild, and that's another thing. A lot of people are calling for Favreau. Let Favreau be the guy to
that too. Yeah,
to make the next movies. But I will say this, Kevin Feige has that movie that he's supposedly involved in.
True.
So you got the Marvel guy trying to make a Star Wars film, mostly because if you read in between the lines, he's kind of like, you guys are starting to screw up Star Wars. I'm a huge Star Wars fan. Let me come in and help fix it. But here's what I find really interesting. Because, okay, of course we're recording our next, our next batch of a few shows. This is a month that we're supposed to get the announcement of the new movie and new director.
Yeah.
And I remember last month, I think it was last one. I don't think they did it in November. I think it was December that they just out of nowhere said, oh, yeah, we're going to announce the new movie and director in January. And we're like, really?
Yeah.
So much for taking a break, which, don't get me wrong, I want to see Star Wars movies in the theater.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you didn't do it every year, you did it every couple. At least it gives you something to look forward to, and
true,
and it gives us something to talk about.
Yeah, I think that the fans are kind of, you won some back, and I think you still have some that are lost, but I think they're looking for their Star Wars elsewhere, and I think now with the saga being over with, maybe those people will finally like, okay, you know what? Let's cleanse our palates almost, and let's look to, like, The Mandalorian is doing well. I have no doubt Clone Wars will do an amazing job. So after Clone Wars, now we are going to look towards the Obi-Wan series, the Cassian Andor series.
Don't forget season 2 of The Mandalorian.
Season 2 of The Mandalorian. But I kind of figure out The Mandalorian is pretty much already in a safe space. I mean, granted, it's only one season, but I feel like it's in the. But what I'm saying, like these new programs that are coming,
like what it's going to be.
Like that's where, like, okay, I think that's what's going to have to restore people's faith in Star Wars, and then when they do decide to make another movie, whether it's with Feige or whomever it shall be, that person right there is going to have to really prove.
Man.
Because
I'll tell you what, a lot of people were talking about the pressure of the Rise of Skywalker. The next movie is going to have an unbelievable amounts of pressure behind it, because this next movie, I'm going to say it right now, in January of 2020, this next movie is going to determine the theatrical future of Star Wars.
No doubt. I completely concur.
And I'm not even talking about like whether or not more will be made. Oh, Disney will continue to,
shove them out. Because they spent too much money purchasing.
Right, well, yeah, but interestingly, they did make all that money back.
Well, true.
But here's the thing. In the fans' eyes, it's going to be like, are they really done with Star Wars? It's going to be a really interesting time. And honestly, it's interesting. I'm using that word a lot. But that's because that's the best word to describe what's going on right now. There's so many things that are of interest when it comes to fan reaction, when it comes to what direction the studio wants to go in. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes I don't know if they're really united, because if you sit there and say, okay, I'm going to ask the fans, like let's say I'm directing the next Star Wars film, or I'm writing it, and I say, okay, I'm going to ask the fans, what do you guys want? Well, who represents the fans? You're going to have everybody saying they want a different thing.
All right.
Somebody's going to be like, make the Yuuzhan Vong series. Mm-hmm. Somebody else is going to say, hey,
give us Thrawn.
Give us Thrawn and that whole thing. Somebody else is going to say, well, go back and show us like Luke and Leia in their younger years training or something. And
or they go on with the old Republic.
Or, it's like every fan is going to say something different.
True.
So how could you say, I'm going to listen to the fans? I mean, all you could do maybe is just start reading what's out there and, well, what are a majority of the fans interested in? Yeah,
I mean, I just think that, you have to give them something. I think that's the advantage of now the Skywalker saga being over with, at least, because now you can either start a new saga or you can start something completely that's like, okay, like I said, Old Republic. All right, boom. That's a whole world that you haven't even touched. So there's no, outside of the game, there's no pretense to that, this can just.
Well, I do find it interesting that, you have like Darth Revan was a statue in the Rise of Skywalker, like in that scene, where they're showing like all the Sith statues.
Oh, okay. I didn't see that
Exegol.
one.
Yeah. Darth Revan's in there. Somebody spotted Darth Nihilist, which I was like, oh, really? So, I mean, they're creeping in some of these characters because, that essentially makes Revan canon now. Mm-hmm. So there's almost kind of like what they did with Thrawn. They plucked him out of the expanded universe, which is now Legends, and
put him in Rebels.
And then they made a trilogy of books, and I hear they're making more books. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's another thing. They can explore the Chiss and the unknown regions, and there's a lot that they could do. It's just, what are they going to do?
True.
But what about you guys? Now that we're in this aftermath period of the Rise of Skywalker and, the future now is wide open as far as what they could do with Star Wars, let us know in the comments what you guys want to see them do next. All right. Now it is time.
Yes.
For my favorite segment, which we just call Clear Your Mind. That's right. This is where we answer your questions. You guys submit them to us, we answer them. Real simple.
Yep.
All right. What do we got first?
All right. The question is,
who's our first victim of the Sarlacc?
Our first victim comes from Leanne Tobert. And her question is, what did you like the most about The Rise of Skywalker?
Yeah. Well, should I just say rewind this podcast or video, whichever, if you're listening to us or watching us on YouTube, either way. What do I like most, though? I think, that's actually a more difficult question than I expected it to be.
Mm-hmm.
Because what's funny is I could cheese out and say, well, just go back and, watch or listen to our spoiler and non-spoiler reviews.
Mm-hmm.
But I won't do that. And what's interesting, too, again with that word, what's fascinating is the fact that my answer may be different now than it was, for those other movies.
Sure.
Or not movies, podcasts. Mind is going. I think, honestly, it's the path of Kylo Ren.
Okay.
I mean, I've got a lot of things that I really loved about The Rise of Skywalker. I love the whole Palpatine thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if I have to choose, what I really loved the most, because if they had to redeem Kylo, it was something that I didn't want, but yet it was something that actually moved me, and I was really invested in it. And I did not think that was going to happen, because I really didn't want them to redeem him.
Mm-hmm.
But I was really kind of cheering on, hey, he's Ben Solo now and all this stuff. And it really made me happy that he was, to see him being a good guy, even though it was only for 5 minutes, because, he pretty much dies. But
You're right.
Spoiler alert. But I think I really liked that. And I really liked the whole Rey storyline a lot more than I thought, too. And of course, Finn.
Okay.
I'm just going to name everything. But
and BB-8.
Another thing I could say that I really like the most is C-3PO.
3PO was...
Honestly,
yeah.
I mean, he really surprised me, because I've always loved 3PO, but I mean, I really liked his whole story arc in the movie.
Yeah.
And just, Rey discovering her lineage and how she was reacting to it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to really love about this movie. Yes, there's a lot of things you can criticize too, but that's...
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm going to go with the Kylo thing. If I had to pick one thing, that would be it.
Okay. I think for me, the biggest thing that I liked the most was the nods of nostalgia that wasn't forced. That made
that actually made sense.
I won't say that made sense, but it was more so that
was natural and more organic.
Natural. Yeah. So the big one was Luke raising the X-Wing up.
Yeah.
That was cool to me.
That was. I got chills, especially because they're playing the same exact music as when Yoda did it.
Yeah, so I thought that was cool. You did get one of your wishes, though, granted in The Rise of Skywalker. I don't know if you realize it, but you remember, of course, in The Force Awakens, when Rey was trying to pull the lightsaber and it flew past her, and then, you always hoped it was going to be Luke who grabbed it.
Oh, you talking about when she threw it and then Luke caught it? Well, I will say this. I thought that was, and this is one of those things that I really paid attention to as far as the subtle nuances of The Rise of Skywalker, because it's Luke going full circle and changing his whole attitude and really having a redemption of his own. Because if you think about it, when we see him at first in The Last Jedi, he's just tossing it. He's had it with the Jedi. He doesn't even want to, he cut himself off from the Force. He doesn't want anything to do with anything, and now he's catching it when somebody else discards it and is like, no, this is,
treat this with respect.
Yeah, you treat this thing with respect. Almost doing the whole Obi-Wan speech that he gave Anakin in Clone Wars or Attack of the Clones. So I really thought that was a great full circle moment that, yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think those nods, were cool. Those moments where it's all right, see what you did there, but it fit. It wasn't shoehorned in of course, like I said, the 3PO stuff, that was hilarious.
Yeah. Yep. All right. So what do we got next?
Next, we have Tony Abdul, and he asked the question, were you surprised that there wasn't any other deaths besides Leia?
Did you see The Rise of Skywalker? I mean, I don't, hey, I love our listeners and viewers, but Leia was not the only death in the Rise of Skywalker.
It was kind of Kylo Ren there.
There was Kylo. That was a big one. Yeah, granted, we got some fake outs.
Yeah. That Chewie one was like...
The Chewie one was a...
That was I mean, we always knew... Well, I thought that he was actually going to die. Honestly.
So did I.
But it still hurts to see it happen.
I thought that the Falcon was going to be destroyed.
Yeah.
I was happy to see that didn't happen.
Yeah. But I guess maybe he's referring to like the main characters, maybe like
Kylo's.
I was outside of Kylo, but we already kind of knew he was going. But I think he's
Palpatine died.
Well, I mean, like Finn, Poe, Lando, that type of thing. I think
that guy, Rose.
I'm really shocked that she noticed. They Jar Jar'd the mess out of her.
Not really, because, and this is another thing that I've debated with people. It's like, well, they wasted Rose. I'm like, how? Is everybody, if you look at a military operation, is everybody featured in every little... No, she was an engineer. She played a very important part to them discovering, a lot of different things. Her character served the part of the story that her character served well. You don't have to cram her in every little scene or have her go on the adventure if she's an engineer. It doesn't make sense.
Well, no, I mean, not that, but I think we thought there was going to be more, even though, like, John Boyega basically said, like, Finn was a bachelor, but just the lead up, the way they kind of had it going in Last Jedi, you kind of thought that you would have more about her.
It's funny movie. Because I didn't even think that at the end of Last Jedi.
Really?
No. Of course, if you you go back and listen to our Last Jedi review, and I'm over there going, I think we're going to see a lot more Rose in the Rise of... But I don't think I thought that, because it was pretty obvious that was a one-sided love thing, even at the end of Last Jedi. I mean, she basically kissed him when he was practically... Well, he kissed her. No, she kissed him.
Somebody kissed somebody.
Well, she kissed him when she had kind of like waken up from her... Or no. He crashed the ship. I got it. No, wait, I got it now. I got this. So he crashes the ship because he was about to commit suicide, pretty much, right? And then she kind of revives him, and then she kisses him. See, I told you I got it.
Right.
Okay, well, it wasn't like he was really reciprocating.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was... She just... Her whole thing was she served a purpose. She was kind of like in a... Let me bring a 24 reference back in. She was sort of like how Chloe or some of these other people at CTU are, like when they're sort of back at the base and they're feeding information to the main characters, so when they run out on their missions, they have what they need, but they're not necessarily on the mission. That's kind of what I always saw her role as being.
Okay.
And it makes sense.
I get it. Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, I just felt like the way they kind of made her kind of a big kind of focal point in Last Jedi, and then for you to just kind of like let her go in this one is kind of like,
yeah,
you thought you were just going to see more, because from the fact that, okay, her sister died, and then of course she stopped Finn. She kind of had that thing with Finn on the base.
I know, you probably figured it was going to be a little bit more like a Lando kind of thing. Like, you introduce the character, she does some stuff, and then you expand the role.
Yeah.
And had, Lucasfilm actually planned out the trilogy, that might have been possible. But this is where I felt really bad for JJ, because it's like, look, you have to do what you can with what you have, given the state of this trilogy. And I think, honestly, that's the key to all this fan division and everything.
Yeah.
I would actually promise everybody watching or listening to this that if Disney maps out another trilogy and plans it, and then puts the right people in place, I think everybody will go Star Wars happy again.
I believe it.
All right.
I think that wraps it up for us today.
That does wrap it up.
Yep.
I think we're done with our show.
Yes, we are done with our show.
I think so. Well, all right. So hopefully, you guys enjoyed this look at the whole aftermath of the Rise of Skywalker. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just hit the little subscribe button down below. If you're listening to us on our podcast, you can certainly go on your, favorite, Spotify or
platform or
whatever
Apple.
Platform. Yeah, wherever you're listening to it on it now, subscribe to it. Let us know in the comments below what you guys think about anything that we talked about today. Want to wish everybody again a happy new year. We're going into a new year. We're going to come up with a lot more programming on this channel, so make sure that you watch for that. And of course, next week we're going to cover even more great stuff in Star Wars. I'm Eric Vansel.
And I'm Daryl Sanders.
May the Force be with you.
Always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you, always.